I'm Jeremy Munday and I work at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. I'm the author of Introducing Translation Studies and with Basil Hatim of Translation and Advanced Resource Book, which some of the viewers might have seen.
Well, I think Introducing Translation Studies is the best book I know on translation theories. And I'm delighted to hear that you're having a second edition. So perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But first of all, could you tell us why you think theory is essential to translation studies and above all to translation studies training?
Right, this question of theory and practice comes up again and again. I think certainly it's essential for translator training. Some might argue that it is not absolutely essential for translator practice because there are still translators out there who work with relatively little training, but that's becoming less and less common these days, I think. I think we can justify the inclusion of a strong theoretical component to translator training for a number of reasons. One is it allows the translator to understand better, I think, what he or she is doing, can explain what he or she is doing, and also can reflect better using meta-language, particular technical terms, understanding different translation procedures and strategies. I sometimes liken it to, perhaps I shouldn't in your company, to a musician. I always feel, or any other expert, who has an understanding of both theory and practice, I would be far more comfortable with that than someone who had just learnt through practice alone, without a strong underpinning of theory. So I think there are a number of reasons why theory is important. Later on, of course, when a trainee becomes a professional translator, I think the theoretical background can be very useful in explaining to a client different facets of the translation, justifying the translator's choice in a particular instance, eliciting information about the translation brief or specific linguistic features of the original.
Translation theories have been prominent, I think, in training for the last, I would say, particularly 20 years. Would you agree with me? Mm-hmm. But one of the most important development was the focus on the analysis of the text to be translated, and the source text as well, so both on the source and target text. What are your perspectives on this?
Right, one of my particular interests is text linguistics, discourse analysis, particularly from a Hallidayan systemic functional viewpoint, and latterly more from a critical discourse analysis perspective. I teach a theoretical model which analyses the source text and target text using text linguistic functional models. But also I try to introduce it into my practical translation classes as well. I think the most important thing that I try to emphasize is how language works, the communicative purpose of language, and that language is being used in order to achieve a particular communicative aim. And many students will not have a linguistic background, which means that sometimes they're rather reluctant to take on board some of the terminology. Hallidayan systemic functional linguistics is a bit heavy topic on terminology, to say the least. So I think inevitably what is offered to them is slightly diluted, but I think the focus on ideational, interpersonal and textual metafunctions and the linguistic realizations of these, particularly looking at use of transitivity, nominalization, modality structures, and areas such as cohesion and thematic word order, can really help them in understanding how language works, how a text works, and in above all, seeing marked structures and beginning to gain an awareness of the need to be sensitive to what is marked in one language and the way that that particular feature may be marked differently in the target language.
And of course there have been theoreticians such as Munday who've made the Hallidayan system much more approachable and allowing us to have first step approach. So I think that for students nowadays it's a lot easier than it was, say, 15 years ago.
I think so. Mona's book was certainly a big step forward at that point, and I think that students nowadays they don't like the terminology, and they struggle sometimes to come to terms with the breadth of the terminology. And certainly I wouldn't give them Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar and tell them to go away and read it. I don't think many of them would come back. But I think it's interesting to try and see or focus perhaps on writer-reader, the relation between writer and reader, the way that normally I would say the writer is the one who has the power and is producing the text in order to create a certain reaction in the target audience, and then when you put the translator in as an extra communicator there, then they've got to be aware of these power relations, these interpersonal relations, how this is realized in any particular text. It may be through pronoun use or use of a passive in order to hide agency, that kind of thing, which we increasingly talk about in translation. So I think this is an interesting area, and it's also the way that evaluation is produced. What Hallidayan linguistics perhaps is not so good at is explaining or what is implicit in a text. It's lexicogrammatical features which realise particular functions, fine, but there may be some unsaid or culturally different item in the source text which needs to be brought out, explicated or whatever in the target text, and so there are limits to how much you can use. I think systemic functional linguistics, and of course one particular area which I find problematic is thematic structure. Even in languages which are close, say English and Spanish, which I mainly work with, Spanish has more flexibility, has verb-subject order much more frequently, although some might argue less so now with the growing influence of English on a certain genre in Spanish. So if you're following a very rigid Hallidayan an analysis of thematic structure, it can break down when you come across more flexible languages, and functional sentence perspective may be an interesting alternative route, which in Mona's book is very under-analysed, I think.
But then there are also other models that can come to our rescue at this stage for what is not so explicit. I think that it is not the only model. No. And these visions of the analysis of the text, you have actually linked to new developments, I would say, in stylistics, linking stylistics and translation studies. Stylistics was nearly dead as a subject in literature or in literary related areas, and it is emerging again in translation and a new guise. So could you talk to us about this a little bit?
Yes, that's quite interesting. Jean Bose-Baer brought out a book in 2006 on stylistics. There was a special issue of Language and Literature in 2004, and other scholars such as Charlotte Bousseau have been writing. My Style and Ideology in Translation came out earlier this year, and it's Yeah, I think it's probably an interesting. I'm not sure if it's a reawakening of interest, because I think it has always been there, but perhaps a more systematic analysis of stylistic differences in translation, and bringing on board areas such as narrative or narratology and point of view, which hadn't really been discussed in much detail in translation before. My own work looked at a translation of Latin American writing in English over the course of the 20th century. There was a series of case studies building on a framework of stylistics, really. But I didn't just limit it to literature. I looked at some political speeches, biographies, even communiques from people such as Su Comandante Marcos and Fidel Castro. So I think it's probably this new interest, if you like, in stylistics and translation is not going to be limited merely to literature, but it's taking that model, taking that approach, and building it into analysis of other forms of communication. I think I see also an interesting potential link to, which I'd like to follow up, to areas such as corpus linguistics and forensic linguistics and authorship studies, which are currently outside translation studies, but I feel that there's a good room there for cooperation and building into translation studies some of these other areas.
So we may have hope of linguists and translators, translation scholars being one again.
Why not?
Another development of recent translation studies has been the need to get away from prescriptive models. And I think that's been very important, not only for literary translation, but also for non-literary, for which this journal is particularly concerned about. Of course, the main scholar who introduced the idea of descriptive theory was Turi, but he very much thought there was scope to go beyond it. How much beyond do you think we are in the study of descriptive studies? How far have his ideas brought us forward?
I think his 1995 book was crucial in translation studies, and it's essential to much work that has occurred in descriptive studies since. In fact, it's impossible to write a descriptive study without mentioning Turi, so I think that speaks for itself. Not sure about that title really, descriptive translation studies and beyond. I note that as we speak, probably running off the press is a Beyond book from John Benjamin's, from Anthony Pym, Schlesinger and Simeone. And I've read Pym's contribution, which I thought was quite interesting, looking at the perceived contradiction in the two laws, Turi's two laws of standardization and interference, and trying to reconcile these in some ways. I think the most important point to bring out, and for future studies, which perhaps links into some of the work on sociocultural context in translation, is the need to determine what the factors are which influence a translator to work towards to a certain tendency. So where does the translator tend to standardize? Where tends to be interference from the original? In what kinds of genre? In what kinds of contexts? Of course, this is such a huge area that I think there's a problem that attempting to specify laws, albeit probabilistic laws, is trying to encompass too many phenomena. and I wonder if that there's really room for some major work on certain translation phenomena. I know recently, for example, studies on explicitation or whatever, but to try and move away from the one-off descriptive study of a particular book or of even a particular author in translation, and try and put together in collaboration wider projects that try and not definitively answer, but certainly answer with more empirical basis some of the long-standing questions about translation.
Particularly in comparative studies, I think, not necessarily regarding language, but also subject fields. I think there's quite a lot of scope for that. So, are you touching on these new developments in the new version of your book, or is this the wrong question to ask? I mean,
no, it's a good question. No, yeah, I've updated the book. I've corrected a few errors, and I apologise for some of the to one or two individuals whose names were incorrect in the original. But no, there are developments. There are changes. I've built in a bit on sociology of translation, not perhaps as much as I might have done, and perhaps that would be for a future update. I've built in quite a bit on audiovisual translation, because I see that, in fact, the new media, localization, audiovisual translation, corpus linguistics, which I think are very interesting, new, in inverted commas, fields. So yes, sociology. There's every chapter has been updated as regards the further reading and the references. So throughout the book, because otherwise it looks a bit odd to have a supposedly contemporary study of translation studies with everything, all the references in the 1990s. I think that's not fair to students and bad practice, really. So I also updated the first section of translation studies as the discipline of translation studies, incorporating some of the work on translation studies as an interdiscipline into that first chapter, because that was an area that had developed since the publication of the first edition in 2001. And an area which I got quite interested in, really, which is the history of translation, and I built that up a bit in the first chapter.
Yes. How necessary do you think the study of history of translation is for people interested in translation studies?
I think for people on, say, an MA translation course, they could become translators without knowing very much about the history, but the ability to, or the knowledge, and allows them to contextualize their own practice, really, and to be more aware of the different constraints and factors that have influenced translation strategies and translation procedures over the course of millennia. So I think it's, as well as being a particularly fascinating area, I think, to try and see how translators worked at different times, very different times, perhaps from ours. I was doing some work on the Publishers' Archive in Reading for a chapter I was writing for Oxford History of Literary Translation, edited by Lawrence Venuti. And there's some fascinating material there that where you can see the lifestyle of the translator coming out. There's one with of a translator from French from the early part of the 20th century, Bernard Mial, and detailing his many financial and other difficulties as he was struggling to make a living at the same time as translating many, many books. So I think it's interesting for to be able to see how translators operate in different cultures as well. It allows the new translator, the trainee translator, to be able to contextualize a bit better. Of course, the history of translation is what has been written is most of the evidence, I suppose, is overwhelmingly biased towards Bible and other and translation of other scriptures, and literary translation. We don't hear very much of commercial translators in ancient Rome, although that would be a fascinating area as well, and nor of interpreting, which predates.
Too busy making money, I think. Yeah. But I think that the history of translation is interesting as well, because it has to be linked to the history of ideas. Mm-hmm. And you were discussing the recent importance of sociology in translation studies, but I don't think this is proper to translation studies. Sociology is at the moment permeating the history of the present history of thought in the most stimulating way. And this is why it is part of translation studies, I think. So I think it's very important to keep an awareness of how ideas are moving, how meanings are moving, but not only in the field of translation, beyond it as well.
Yes, I think so. It's quite interesting how translation and, as you say, other fields adopt similar models or similar concepts in their own analysis. Bourdieu, for example, appears everywhere now. I mean, I suppose some have criticised translation studies for sometimes not having its own models, and for importing so many ideas and approaches. And I suppose that links to the history of the discipline, or the interdiscipline, in many ways. So as a new discipline has to struggle for its institutional existence, and does this in many different ways to import foreign models is not necessarily a weakness, although, as Chesterman points out, there is the danger of some superficiality if you're just importing labels rather than really fully understanding or manipulating the ideas that underpin them.
Of course, the problem we have in translation studies as regards theory and training is most of the students who are interested in those fields very much want vocational courses. They want hands-on, mm-hmm. They want that job in translation. How do we reconcile them? How do you attract your student to theory?
On that particular kind of program, as you rightly say, they're interested in the vocational aspects. So I suppose that would explain the bias towards those theories that are more readily applicable to the everyday hands-on translation that they do. So that would explain the bias towards, say, functional theories rather than post-colonial theories. Although perhaps that balance would be different on programs that were more focused on research or on comparative literature, or rather than the everyday translation, professional translation. But I think that's an advantage for bringing theory into some of these programs. So at Leeds, for example, we focus on translation quality, how translation quality is assessed, different models for assessing it. We also, in that way, bring in work on different international organisations and how quality is assessed there, the different procedures. For all sorts of different kinds of texts, including online texts. Increasingly, localization is becoming taking over from translation, if you're in certain areas, and work from the functionalists, from Reis and Vermeer, and the importance of the different actors in the process. And students seem to take that on board perhaps more readily than some of the less obviously applicable theories. that shows, I think, when you see how many of them answer the different questions for their essays. They're particularly interested in the moment as translators and interpreters, as mediators or interveners.
Now, we've talked a little bit about your new book, but do you have a new research topic at the moment that you might want to discuss?
I've trying to take stock at the moment. The Style and Ideology book was focused, as I said, on Latin American writing in English. And one interesting area that I'd like to, well, two interesting areas that I'd like to follow up from that. One of is the translation of political speeches, and more specifically, the translation of online translation of political communiques by people such as Subcomandante Marcos, which, as far as I can see, tend to be carried out by not necessarily non-professional translators, but certainly translators who may not be formally trained. And obviously, the form of the dissemination of the documents is different, and the web gives the possibility of some of these organisations disseminating material which would never have been disseminated so widely before. So I'm quite interested in investigating that within the context of Latin America. And the other area which is interesting is translation and creativity. I think I'm interested in variation between different translations. What gets changed in translations? It never ceases to fascinate me that you can give a translation to just two different people, and there will hardly be 4 or 5 words in a row which are the same. So I'm interested in perhaps analysing that and doing some experiments to try and understand that a little bit better.
Gosh, so cognitive
I'm
studies,
quite
really
interested in following that.
Quite different from the corpus linguistic tack, which is
yes and no. There's one in Style and Ideology. I noted the work of Michael Hoey and his lexical priming, his concept of lexical priming, in his 2005 book. And the way that certain words are, in his view, are primed to occur in certain ways in certain genres. He gives an example of a phrase such as "in winter," which may occur, say, in travel texts in first position in English. Whereas in other kinds of genre, they would either that would be replaced by something like I think it was "over the winter months" in gardening texts, or it may be shifted to the right in, say, fictional texts. And I think it'd be interesting to that concept of lexical priming he analysed through reference corpora. Very interestingly, mainly in a monolingual context, but I think it has a lot of potential for comparative linguistic analysis. And also I'm interested in how that concept of lexical priming, of how a word is primed to occur in a certain way, can be linked to idiolectal use by different translators. So we all individually speak differently. What causes this? It's educational, social, experiential background. We all have very slightly different tics, which are conveyed in whatever communication we produce. That's why I mentioned that other areas which would be interesting to bring into this kind of study would be forensic linguistics. For example, or authorship studies, authorship attribution, which attempt to work out if a particular text was written, or what are the particular features of a text which may be characteristic of that particular author. So that's probably the kind of project that requires experts in several different fields in order to fully realise the potential.
But it could apply as well to every aspect of translation, not just literary translation,
Oh,
even,
indeed, yeah.
even more so outside of literature, I would think.
Yeah, indeed, any kind of translation.
Is there anything you would like to mention? I think we haven't really touched about the last question, but about the development, we brushed it up during about linguistics, literature, sociology.
The development of translation studies. I think you mentioned earlier. Chesterman's interesting view of the development from linguistics for the import of literature and linguistics and onto cultural turn and sociology. I think one thing which I'd like to just say is that I suppose inevitably, because of institutional funding, etc., and many try to make out that such and such is the new term in translation studies. I would hope that at times the rivalries between these different terms don't stop people collaborating as well, because I think each of the different approaches which Chesterman mentions have brought something new and valuable to translation studies, and it would be short-sighted, I think, to disregard one in favour of another when each has the potential to assist.